Okay, it is 7 o'clock, and so since this is a officially posted meeting of the board of the Garland ISD School Board, we will call the meeting to order. And our first item would be to recognize that we do have a quorum present. My name is Rick Lambert. I'm the president of the Garland ISD School Board. In addition to that, we have the following school board members present. I'd ask that you stand up when I call your name. Larry Glick, Vice President. Scott Luna, Secretary. Linda Griffin. And Charles Axe, who is Assistant Secretary. All right, seeing a quorum present, as I said, we'll call this meeting to order. The first thing we want to do before we get to our action item, which is the town hall meeting, is to recognize a few distinguished representatives that we have here today. First of all, I'm aware that we have representatives from the city of Rowlett, Mayor Gattel, Ed Balderas with the emergency manager, and then also Fire Chief Neil Howard. Thank you very much. Do we have any representatives from the city of Garland? Yes, please stand. Well, I'll recognize you guys separately. But is there any other representatives from the city of Garland? What about the city of Saxe? Okay. All right. In addition, we have got some representatives from Baylor Garland, Dr. Stephen Arze, Chief Medical Director and Vice President of Medical Affairs, Karen Busby, the Manager of Environmental Safety, Sonia Nappage, the RN for Infection Prevention, and Ava Hummel, the Manager of Marketing and Public Relations. From the Garland Health Department, the health department that represents our Tri-Cities. First we have Dr. Tim Lambert, who is the health authority for Garland, Rowlett, and Saxe. Jason Chesser, who is the director of the health department. Diana Oates, the public health manager. And Molly Rivas, the emergency management coordinator. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate our healthcare representatives and our city representatives being present today. Our city officials, the Garland Independent School District, and our health care officials take the safety of our students and our citizens very seriously. For that reason, we have called this town meeting tonight in order to answer questions and receive information regarding Ebola. And we are going to open it up for discussion after our speakers make a presentation. And I want to set a couple of ground rules for that. Please make sure that your questions are related to Ebola. That is the purpose for our meeting tonight. We are inviting folks to submit written questions, and I've got a number of them that are going to be brought up here in a minute. If you want to submit a written question, then there is a table at the back where you can submit your written question, and then I can present them all at one time. If you would prefer instead to ask your question from the mic, that's okay too. We were just trying to handle the questions in a written format for efficiency purposes. Remember that our speakers here tonight are volunteers, so please be respectful of that fact and the fact that they have volunteered their time. We expect that we ought to be able to answer questions that address any concerns for the audience by 8:30, and so we're going to try to conclude by that time, so please keep that in mind. And then also, this is for the audience to ask questions. This is not a time for us to make statements with regard to policy issues, so we'd ask that you focus your attention on the questions for our speakers. At this time, I want to introduce our speakers. First, special thanks to the Dallas County Medical Society for their leadership in this effort to educate our communities. And I want to recognize our two speakers. First, Dr. Jane Siegel, Dr. Siegel, who is sitting at the far end of the table, has been in practice for 40 years. Dr. Siegel is a pediatric infectious disease specialist and professor of pediatrics at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas. Dr. Siegel received her MD from Boston University School of Medicine. She was the inaugural medical director of infection prevention and control at Children's Medical Center in Dallas. Dr. Siegel currently chairs the State of Texas Healthcare Associated Infection and Preventable Adverse Events Advisory Panel. That's quite a mouthful. And then sitting to my right is Dr. Haley. Dr. Haley is the director of the Division of Epidemiology and the professor of internal medicine at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas. Dr. Haley received his MD from the University of Texas Medical School. Dr. Haley spent 10 years early in his career at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He supervised the development of the first set of CDC guidelines for infection control in hospitals, including the guideline for isolating patients with infectious diseases. In practice for 43 years, he holds the U.S. Armed Forces Veterans Distinguished Chair for Medical Research, honoring America's Gulf War veterans. So as you can tell from that biography for both of our speakers, they're both eminently qualified to speak on this issue. They have spoken at other town hall meetings in our community and have graciously agreed to come here tonight and give us a presentation with regard to the current status of the disease, as well as other questions regarding the disease. So, Dr. Siegel, were you going to start?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for reaching out to the Dallas County Medical Society and inviting us to join you tonight. And we are delighted to be here because we think having a dialogue with people in the community is the best way to handle a situation like what we've experienced over the past 3 weeks. I have just a few slides, so this isn't a long presentation. This slide is just to orient us geographically. In the 3 countries that we're mainly concerned about is Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, where most of the cases have been and where we've had an ongoing outbreak since March of 2014. And you can see down in the corner that with those little blue arrows to Spain and to Texas, Dallas, Texas, where there have been each with 1 case where there was a transmission. Just to keep us all on the same page, and I know that you hear these numbers all the time, as of October 20th, 2014, these are the estimated numbers. I think in Africa the numbers are probably a bit higher, but you can see the total with widespread transmission in those 3 countries. The total number of cases is actually 9,278, with and the lab confirmed are those that actually had lab testing, but in a situation like this we can make the clinical diagnosis, and there's about a 50% mortality rate. Those that are travel associated are Senegal and Spain, and I really want to emphasize Senegal because there was 1 case in Senegal with no transmissions, and that patient survived, and that's really remarkable, and that country has been declared no risk as of September 20th. And then in Spain, there was 1 case with 1 transmission. Then if we look at Nigeria, this is another very important experience to look at, because in this case there was 1 patient that traveled to Nigeria, and there were many contacts. Close to 1,000 people were actually considered as possible contacts, but from that 1 patient there were 20 secondary cases, 20 transmissions, and with a 40% case fatality rate. Those that became ill were those that had unprotected contact with that individual as he was just coming in from the plane and to the hospital. Another set of numbers is to look at the surveillance of the contacts of the 3 cases in Dallas as of October 20th, 2014. And I did hear just on the news tonight that the second nurse has been declared free of Ebola and should be coming out of isolation soon. So that's wonderful news for us. So the status of the contacts, you can see there's a total of 172 contacts, and as you know, there have been completed surveillance, actually on about 60 people now. The only transmissions were to those 2 nurses, and none of the other community contact, the family that had contact with the first patient, the index case, or the healthcare workers that had contact with him in the emergency room on the first visit, no one developed infection. At the bottom, I've listed the number of people that are estimated to be followed relating to the flights, and it's a fair number of people, but we will have information, and we expect that there will be no transmission. So in this last slide, I'm just going to give you the highlights of what we know about Ebola in terms of transmission and safety. So the first point, Ebola virus is transmitted by actually touching a person who's sick with disease, and most often when it's latent illness, because there's an enormous load of virus in patients as they progress on in their illness. It's spread by direct contact with blood and body fluids, and especially the diarrheal fluid in people that are sick with disease. And one of the most challenging aspects of caring for a patient with Ebola is the massive, massive amount of diarrhea that they have. Surfaces, we all worry about surfaces, and we heard a lot about the apartments and disinfecting them and decontaminating them. But surfaces actually play very little role in the transmission, and they can be disinfected fairly easily with household bleach. If there's actually wet and warm fluid like blood on a surface, that may be more infectious, but anything that's dried is unlikely to be infectious, and we use 24 hours as a time period that the virus would last. But it's probably much less when it dries out. Ebola patients who are infectious and who are sick and symptomatic are really too sick to be out and about in the community. So I think that there were a lot of fears about going to the grocery store or just out in the community, but the patients that are really infectious would never be able to be on public transportation and out and about. Contacts of contacts are not infectious. We've had many, many questions about contacts of contacts. And that is a person who perhaps was on that plane coming back from Cleveland who is completely asymptomatic, and that person's child is going to school. Well, the contact is not infectious, and neither is the child. And Ebola cannot be transmitted in schools by children who are well. In order for this virus to be transmitted, individuals that are infected are sick. So people who are well and asymptomatic, no fever, are not infectious. As we hear so much about the planes, no one has ever become sick with Ebola or similar types of viruses from being in a plane at the same time as an individual who is infected. And there are studies that have looked at that. So I think we can be fairly assured, and then we'll have some more information after the 21-day period is up. Pets do not transmit Ebola, and fortunately, our one Dallas nurse's dog has been treated quite well, which we're very happy for. And as long as we're talking about preventing infection, let's not forget that we're going into the flu season, so we're much more likely to encounter people with flu, so let's really concentrate on flu vaccine and doing other things to prevent the flu. So that concludes my remarks.
Okay, let me now enlarge on this, and we're going to leave this slide up during the whole evening so you can go back and read that, because those are the key points. If you don't take anything else away, take those points away. Now, how do we know this? I think that this is a little bit reassuring, but I think it's going to be a lot more reassuring when you hear how we know this. You know, Ebola has been around since 1976. The first epidemic occurred in Africa, in the Congo and southern Sudan in 1976. Actually, one of my comrades that I served with at the CDC, the very first year we were there, he was called out to go to Africa, and he ended up investigating the first epidemic of Ebola. And he stayed for 30 years in Africa studying Ebola and these other things. And there's been a host of other doctors and researchers combing Africa, finding there have been about 20 epidemics in Africa, most of them small little things that came and they were able to be snuffed out pretty quickly. I think there have been 3 that were fairly large in several hundred cases, until, of course, what we just saw in West Africa. And what happened in West Africa was the same virus which had been occurring over in East Africa and sort of Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. Somehow that virus jumped over into West Africa on the west coast to those 3 countries. And it infected a bat. Probably a bat moved over there several years ago, and a woman harvested a bat in harvesting bushmeat. They kill bats, which are considered a delicacy over there, by the way, and became infected with Ebola when cleaning that bat. And she became infected. Members of her household became infected as they nursed her. Then when she died, they had a big funeral, and as is their custom, they embraced her during the funeral, and like 19 people at the funeral got it and died. And so from there, it just was like throwing a match in gasoline. Those 3 countries have been riddled with revolutions and guerrilla movements, and so nobody trusts anybody. Their civic institutions are destroyed. Their hospitals are primitive. They don't have equipment to take care of themselves. And so when this thing broke out, it's just been extremely difficult to address it, and it's still increasing, okay? And that's why a man got on a plane from Liberia, one of those countries, and came here perfectly well, and then after 4 days living in Dallas, developed the illness. Okay, now, after 36 years of research on this virus, we know a lot. And there are only 3 groups of people who get this in Africa. And this is what you need to remember. The people who get it are the family members who are nursing a person who is dying of Ebola. Somebody who's in bed, can't get up, and they're having profuse diarrhea and vomiting, and the people are changing their bed sheets and taking care of them and exposing themselves to those bodily fluids. So people in the household get infected and die. The second group that gets it is if there is a hospital nearby, they take them to the hospital and the hospital workers take care of them, but they don't have the isolation gear and the know-how that we have to protect the hospital workers, so the hospital workers get it. And in fact, in some of these smaller outbreaks, the way they knew it was Ebola was when the first doctor or nurse died. That's the clue that you've got Ebola and it's not malaria or something else. So the second group is hospital workers who are unprotected, taking care of the people in the terminal part of their illness. And the third group that died, as I mentioned, is the people who attend the funeral and prepare the body, often prepare the body at home, change the clothes, wipe them up and so forth, and then take the body. And people embrace the body at the funeral, which is a common custom in some of those areas. And they then get infected and may die. That's the only groups of people who get it in Africa. Now, from an epidemiologic standpoint, we reason backwards and say, if those 3 groups get it, it appears that it's being transmitted by the bodily fluids that people are heavily exposed to in the terminal phase of illness. Not when they first get the fever, but in the terminal stage of the illness, okay? Now, if it were airborne, who would get it? Well, everybody would get it. And it wouldn't matter whether you went to the funeral or were in the family, everybody would get it. Well, we're not seeing everybody get it. And what if it was transmitted on surfaces? and one of these people vomits or has diarrhea out in public, well, then everybody who went to that theater or went to that restaurant, or what, they would all get it. Well, we don't see that. See, and it was the same thing back in the early days of AIDS. You remember there was this theory that mosquitoes might transmit AIDS. Well, if mosquito transmitted AIDS, who would get it? It would be children and adults who work outside, working, well, that's not who gets it. See, so you know that's not a reasonable idea. And so given that, in this country, we would expect that the people who would get it would be people who are heavily exposed to that first case, that man, and who were taking care of him in the terminal phase when he was having diarrhea. Well, remember, he was living with his family. None of them got it because as soon as he started vomiting and having diarrhea, he was taken to the hospital where he was isolated, and the family has not gotten sick, and it's way beyond 21 days. So we know they're not going to get it because, and so that illustrates the second main point, and that is the amount of virus that you have in your body and thus that you're shedding and possibly infecting somebody with, the amount of virus is very minimal early in the disease, and it grows over time so that by the time you start having diarrhea and vomiting, you're starting to get a large amount of virus, and it just goes up geometrically from there. Now, what causes the fever? This, I think, is really helpful. The fever comes when the first viruses get into the blood, and the white blood cells, you know, your protection, engulf the virus, and then as soon as they engulf the virus, they notice a foreign invader, and they start secreting these little proteins called cytokines, and that's what gives you the fever. So the fever first appears when the very first few viruses appear. Well, when there are just a few viruses, you're not infectious. You have to have lots of virus to be infectious. And that takes up to a week, usually about a week, and by that time you're starting to have nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting, and then you're highly infectious. So who's most at risk? Well, in this country, it'll be, those people will be going to the emergency room and into the isolation unit, and so it's the doctors and nurses who are at risk. And we've had 2 secondary cases in Dallas. It was transmitted to people. Who were they? Were they members of the community? No, they were 2 nurses who were in there changing their sheets, changing their clothes, you know, taking care of these patients, cleaning up the bodily fluids, and that's who got sick because it was in the terminal phase of the illness. All right, so based on those principles, people who are exposed to a case before they're infectious are not really exposed. They don't get any virus, so they're not going to get sick, and they're no threat to anyone else. And certainly, as Dr. Siegel pointed out, they're children of somebody who was near a patient but not really exposed. Their children are not exposed, and therefore they're not a risk to anyone. And those are the main, that's Ebola 101. And if you've got those points, almost everything else, the answers to almost all the other questions follow right from that line of reasoning. And it's actually a pretty simple subject. One other thing about surfaces. And of course, you know, you would think if this is a virus, gee, get on that surface. And I've read that there are lab experiments that show it might live on there for a day or maybe 3 days. Well, those are laboratory experiments where they're carefully done to see what's the maximum it might ever live. But much more important, there was a really good study in Africa by the CDC team studying a big epidemic in Tikrit, city in Congo. I think it was 173 people got sick with Ebola, and they studied all the people that were exposed to those people to see how many, you know, to the initial cases, to see what caused you to get infected. And they found that being exposed, if they looked at all the people who were exposed to an Ebola case in the first week of their illness, first week after the fever started, almost none of them got it. Whereas if they were exposed in the second week, almost all the people who got it later infection, it was exposure in the second week. Okay? So And the second finding was they went to a hospital that had Ebola patients who were dying of Ebola, had diarrhea, vomiting, high amounts of virus, and they sampled all around the room on every surface, on the tabletops, on the floors and the walls and the doctor's suits and the patient's bed. They could not isolate the virus from anything except the wet blood on the glove of the doctor. The only place they could actually identify a living virus that was capable of infecting somebody. Okay, so that's the study that everybody really relies on to, and it was a very well done study, very scientific, suggesting that, yeah, you might be able to find a virus here and there, but those viruses on the walls and the floors don't tend to get onto people and infect people, and there are not enough numbers to do it. And this has led to an expression among the Africa Ebola fighters, who there are a lot of them, Doctors Without Borders, you've heard of them, and the CDC people and WHO. They have an expression, when it dries, it dies. When it dries, it dies, and that's practically speaking, in terms of seeing who gets Ebola, that has been borne out in experience. So yeah, in the lab you can keep something alive on a surface longer than that, but in terms of infecting people, it just plays virtually no role in this, unless it's a wet puddle of blood or a wet puddle of diarrhea. Yes, that would then be very infective, but just a dry floor where somebody walked is not a problem. Okay, so that's Ebola 101. Now we'll open it up to questions and see how we apply that.
Mr. Moore, do you have any written questions? If anybody else wants to submit a written question, you can do it at the back for those that have just come in. And then we also will have the mic open too if there's any questions after that. Okay, the first question is, can you please explain the difference between aerosolized and airborne?
So when we talk about airborne, we're talking more about, the best example is tuberculosis, where you can be in a room down the hall and never have any contact with the patient, but the infectious agents can travel through the air on air currents. When we talk about aerosolized, we're talking about aerosolizing procedures where there may be some small amount of virus in saliva and respiratory secretions, but if one is actually putting a breathing tube into the patient or giving a breathing treatment where there's an aerosol that's created, that means there are small droplet particles of fluid that's in the air, and there's concern that that could be transmitted. But it is important to remember that relative to the diarrhea and the vomiting, there is less virus, there is some virus in saliva or respiratory secretions. And sometimes when we say when you hear airborne, some influenza is transmitted through small droplets of respiratory secretions, but it only goes a short distance. It goes 3 feet, and those droplets are also heavy and they fall to the ground, whereas something that's transmitted through the airborne route are very small and they stay in the air.
All right, there are several questions that I have here that ask about treatment rooms, and so I'm assuming from the questions that they're general questions with regard to the protocol for treatment rooms, et cetera. If there's a question about a specific facility, then we can try to address that too. But the first question is, what is the biosafety level of the treatment rooms / isolation rooms where Ebola patients are treated?
So Ebola patients are managed in this country in what we call negative pressure rooms. And that means that the air circulates and goes to the outside. the air does not circulate to other rooms. The air from a specific room goes to the outside. And that's what we use for isolation of patients with tuberculosis, with chickenpox, with measles, and that's very effective. We also use rooms, these isolation rooms will have what we call an anteroom, which is an adjacent room that you go through a door where we can keep all of the supplies. So that's very separate from the patient.
All right. The question assumes that the Methodist Health System at 401 Campbell is the Dallas area's Ebola treatment center. Are there any other Ebola treatment centers in the DFW area, and if so, where?
No, that has just been announced that there's been an agreement that Methodist Hospital, the Methodist Hospital system is going to make available in their Richardson Methodist Hospital facility an area in that hospital that is where the next Ebola patient, if there is one, would go to be taken care of, and University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center by Parkland would provide the staffing for that unit and would train their staff and drill them and so forth, so they would be prepared to do that. And in the meantime, they're immediately making that space available. They're going to do whatever construction or modifications necessary so that that will be a very safe place to do it. And so at that point, Dallas will be prepared to know exactly where the patients will go to get the best care, but also to be the safest for the city. And as far as I know, there's not going to be any other units.
Sir,
Wait, let me elaborate. One other thing. We also have a very fine facility down in Galveston, which has been there for about 15 years, which has a very elaborate containment area where they do research on Ebola and other very dangerous pathogens. But because they're doing research, that thing has to be very, very carefully designed. It was built from the ground up for that purpose, but it has an isolation unit in there that has been there to house if any researchers accidentally got an infection of Ebola or something else. And so they're capable of caring for this disease well and have made themselves available. So if we, for example, have too many patients, we would be able to transfer patients down there, but we can also transfer them to Emory or to Bethesda, to NIH, or to Omaha, which are other units. And CDC is now working in every city for every city to develop a similar contingency plan so they would know exactly where people go. In those units, they'll be exquisitely trained and ready to react.
Dr. Haley, before we get to the audience member that just stepped up, that you mentioned something that's related to another question that I have here, and it was about the Galveston facility. And the question is the Galveston UT Medical Branch facility the same as or related to the Galveston Nation Laboratory?
Yes. That laboratory is called the Western Regional Center of Excellence for Biocontainment Research. So the Western Regional Center is its actual official name, and yes, that is the same. And let me say, Galveston, the reason it was located there, I was on a panel that representatives of all the different University of Texas and various hospitals and research things all over the state. We all got together and supported putting one there in Galveston because they've got about a 75-year history of having done some of the world-class research on these dangerous germs. They've been doing it since really the 40s, the 1940s. So they are the expertise in research in this part of the country, and have done some great stuff in there in the last 15 years since it was established.
Sir, did you have a question?
I do.
Before you do, would you please tell us what your name is?
Jason Holloway.
Okay, Mr. Holloway.
My question is, you say that surfaces play very little role in transmission of Ebola. My question to that is, how closely related is the Ebola virus with the norovirus?
Oh, good question. They're both RNA viruses, so they're in sort of the same, you can divide all viruses into two parts, but they're not very closely related in other ways. The neurovirus is highly infectious. As you know, it can it regularly sweeps through all these pleasure cruise ships, and it's very difficult to eradicate environment. It's very persistent in the environment and just a real pain to get rid of, and they can scrub those ships down till the ship comes home, and it's hard to get. So no, Ebola is just completely on the other end of the spectrum. It's very fragile, does not survive well. Sunlight kills it quickly, so it's just the opposite.
Thank you.
Good, very good question. Yeah, because norovirus is a real difficult problem. Fortunately, it's not a fatal illness.
All right. The next question is C.J. Peters being consulted or involved in the Ebola outbreaks?
Yes, I know C.J. Peters wrote one of the bestseller books about being a virus. He was a virus hunter. My good friend that I served at CDC with is Joe McCormick. You might have seen him quoted in the paper being very critical of what's going on. He's now down in Brownsville. He spent 30 years in Africa chasing Ebola and those other diseases, and he wanted to come back home to Texas, and he located in Brownsville because he really wanted to apply his principles of dealing with those kinds of diseases. And as you know, the border area has real problems. So he located in the area of the state that had the biggest problems. He's a real hero. And C.J. Peters is the other one. He was in the Defense Department during those years, and then came to the CDC later and spent a lot of time in Africa and did a lot of the great research studies. Yes, he's not been, I don't think he's been involved in the Dallas incident, but he's located down in UT Medical Branch Galveston in that facility and is doing great research down there. So you bet, he's on our Texas team.
Okay. I think this has been addressed to a certain extent, but if you've got anything to add with regard to the decontamination procedures for the professional healthcare workers who treat Ebola patients or the waste products, could you add to that?
How waste is handled?
Or any decontamination procedure for healthcare professionals who treat the patients.
So the guidance that we have from the CDC based on experience is that human waste can be put into the sewage system. The sewage systems are designed specifically to kill agents, infectious agents, so that is safe. And I believe at Emory they actually put bleach in with that as an extra safety measure. Other medical waste must be incinerated, must be autoclaved first to make sure everything is, there's no live virus, and then it is incinerated. And as far as the homes go, I know we've seen a lot in the news about decontamination. I think that these are contacts, the nurses who became ill, really didn't have the large kind of exposure to their homes that we hear of when we have much sicker patients. So I think that the usual kind of cleaning with household bleach is very effective and would be what we would recommend.
Yeah, let me add, there was a lot in the press. A big deal was made of the fact that in Presbyterian Hospital, there was one anteroom where they put all the contaminated supply. After they would use gowns and gloves and material from the patient, they would stack it in the next room in a big room for the waste. And the idea was to every day have one of the companies that deals with those things to come in, take it and incinerate it and get rid of it. The problem happened immediately. They discovered that the federal, state, and local regulations were all different for how that was to be handled. And so the people who were going to take it away, if they'd done anything, one or two of those agencies would have gotten them in trouble, And so they were paralyzed. Nobody could remove the waste. And it was not because anybody was negligent, it's just they realized this is something nobody had ever had occasion to deal with, and so they had discovered these were all different. And then ultimately the CDC stepped in and took it over, took control of it, and disposed of it correctly, and they've quickly resolved this impasse, so it's not a problem anymore. But there was a lot of backbiting in the press of how negligent it was not to be carrying that away. Well, you know, they couldn't, but that was eventually solved.
But I recently heard a lecture by Dr. Bruce Ribner, who was the infectious disease doctor at Emory, who took care of the first patient, the doctor from Fort Worth. And he shared with us what some of the challenges and obstacles were. And so when they first admitted Dr. Brantley, he got a call from the water utilities people and said, "Are you planning to flush human waste into the sewage system?" And he said yes. And they said, "Well, if you do that, we're going to turn off your water supply." And so they were not comfortable with accepting that. And so that's when they came on the agreement that they would put bleach in. And then when they, so Emory is located just down the street from CDC, and CDC is the main place that does the testing. When they wanted to send blood samples from the patients, the couriers would not deliver the blood, would not take the blood samples to CDC, so people just walked it down the street. So I think there are all those kinds of things that, and the enormous amount of medical waste that they had that had to be autoclaved. And, so here Emory was set up to do this, but when faced with the first patient, they ran into the various things that had to be addressed.
How is UV light being utilized in the decontamination process?
I don't know that it is being
It's
utilized. I don't know that it's really necessary. UV light is effective, but the type of UV light that you read in the newspapers that's in the hospitals, I mean, that's kind of a big machine that has to come into the room, and I don't think that would really be appropriate because of the
It's not
risk.
necessary.
Yeah. And I think we have very good ways of decontaminating the areas.
Can pictures be provided of the treatment rooms of potential Ebola patients?
And pictures of the, you mean just so the public would know what it looked like? Or?
I don't have any context for the question other than that.
Yeah, good question. I mean, you know, I think that's a very interesting question in that, you know, when you're dealing with something, this is a frightening disease, there's no doubt about it. It's got a 50 to 70% mortality rate in Africa. I don't think it would be as high here by any means, but still it's a frightening disease. And whenever there's something frightening, this is a free society, you know, and we need to be getting honest information out, and unless there's some reason we can't, you know, if that were a request, I think somebody would take a picture and publicize. If the press, for example, wanted to take a picture of the room at Presbyterian, I expect they would let them do it.
But you can probably see pictures of isolation rooms just like the isolation room that was used at Presbyterian online. I know that
Google
the
it,
Emory has pictures of the design of their unit, and I would imagine that you could see pictures of the ideal type of isolation room. It's all hospitals have to have a certain number of these isolation rooms. They're required to have a certain number.
The next question is kind of similar, and maybe you're already aware of this, these training videos in existence that folks could see, but can training videos be provided of healthcare workers who are in the process of decontaminating materials or disposing of waste?
There are, there's an excellent training video of putting on the personal protective equipment and taking it off. That's on the Texas Medical Association website, texmed.org. And I think that that's one video that shows how to put on and take off the materials, and I imagine we'll be seeing more videos coming out from CDC now that they have made some revision to their recommendations for the personal protective equipment. So I think that I would be sure to go to a reliable site and not just any YouTube, but I think that those two would be very good.
Yeah, the TMA, Texas Medical Association, is our medical professional organization in Texas, and they have a really good site. Let me say it again, TexMed, TEXMED.org, and they have a whole site on Ebola that is very helpful. Also, Dallas County Medical Society has a great website with an Ebola section as well, and that's Dallas County.
DCM, is it DCMS?
I forgot. We'll think about it in a minute.
But if you just Google Dallas County Medical
Yeah,
Society,
that's
it'll
it.
take you to the page.
Yeah, it's a great website.
For parents and students that are following this issue, also if you're not already aware, the Garland ISD website has got a page regarding Ebola, and we post updates, including the information from the Medical Society and others as we receive it, and as it affects our students and our stakeholders, we will post information specific to the district concerns. The other question, though, about contamination, at what level or biosafety level are healthcare workers being protected? Are they wearing full respirators, positive pressure suits, other protective garments?
Let me address that. This is probably the most contentious issue that has come up, and it has led to a lot of recrimination against the hospital and against the CDC. You know, the press always has to find somebody who did wrong and expose them and embarrass them and so forth. And I think they've directed a lot of fire at the hospital and at the CDC. But let me explain, here's what I think is the truth. When that patient went into Presbyterian Hospital, they put him in isolation, and the nurses and the doctors had meetings. They got together. In fact, they had already been together even the week before that patient came in. They had been drilling on how to take care of an Ebola patient. So that hospital was prepared. Anybody who says they weren't prepared just doesn't know what happened. They were prepared. And then when the patient came in, they got together and got out the CDC guidelines, which are, by the way, ask anybody in any hospital, the CDC guidelines for infection control are like the Bible. Every hospital reads those, and for every aspect of infection control, hand washing, disposal of contaminated stuff, how to isolate patients, every aspect of infection control, the CDC has guidelines. And the reason they're so much honored and followed is because the CDC has this process for every subject that needs to have guidelines. They bring in a special blue ribbon committee of people who working in the field, not CDC people, but people working in the field, experts. And they come in and they develop a guideline, and it takes them a year or two, or in fact,
Or 3 or 4.
I was on it many years ago, and Jane was the secretary of it up until the mid-2006 or 7. And I mean, a lot of us have been on those panels because they get experts, they vet these things, they put them in the Federal Register for external comment for a long time. They're based on evidence. And so when they come out, everybody tries them, and they just are very effective, very practical and good. So Ebola's been in there for many years. It's been revised several times. All the Ebola experts from Africa have commented on it. But when those nurses started taking care of that patient, when the first nurse got sick with Ebola, I was shocked. I was shocked. Everybody was shocked because we were completely confident. Everybody in this country, I'm telling you, everybody in this country was confident that would never happen in the United States because we practiced very careful infection control with all the right gear, we thought, just all the right procedures. Everybody was trained. We were shocked. And then the CDC came in and they looked at it and they were shocked. And there was so much pressure from the outside. Then everybody started name calling and scapegoating. The problem is it was not CDC's fault. It was not the hospital's fault. The guidelines were insufficient. The guidelines were wrong, and that's kind of shaken everybody. But it was a blind spot. It was our limitation of our knowledge, maybe a little hubris that we thought we could do things better than they were doing them in Africa, and we didn't have to be, quite as diligent or whatever. But it was a blind spot, and those were reviewed by at least 3 different times by outside experts, the Ebola people, everybody, and they were implemented in 5,000 U.S. hospitals for 20 years. No one ever suggested that that would happen. Nobody ever suggested there was anything wrong with the way we were doing it. And so the fault is not with the hospital. The people did not make mistakes. They did it exactly as they were supposed to. And you can imagine if you were a nurse in that unit and you had an Ebola, you were staring Ebola in the face, would you be careless? Those people were trying as hard as they could, but the guidelines, the procedure was defective. It was something wrong with it. And so now what's happened is the CDC has come, the state health department, the local health department, the experts in the hospital. They have been combing over what's being done. They've been looking at every aspect, and now the CDC has come out with a revision just yesterday, and they're about to implement this all over the country. In other words, well, let me say it like this. In a war, no battle plan survives the first shot. This was the first shot. Now, there have been several patients to Emory and Omaha, but those were people who had been sick and were kind of over the hump, and then they were brought back for care, so they were already known. This was the first patient who got sick in the United States and had to be identified from the population of sick people, put in the hospital, and suddenly the hospital was faced with carrying. That was the first real test. And from that, yes, 2 nurses got sick. Fortunately, they're both going to survive, and they're both doing extremely well now, and they're going to be out of the hospital pretty soon. But nevertheless, this was a chance to learn, and we have learned. We've got the greatest minds and this terrific collaboration at all levels, from the CDC down to the hospital level. Everybody's been collaborating and straining to get this right, and now we've got another set of guidelines to go in the future. So, yeah, it's been tough. Everybody's sad that the 2 nurses got sick, but this is what happens. This is a deadly disease, and this is the first time it's been here, and I think we're going to be in good shape from here. But I wanted to get that out of whose fault it was. I don't know if any of you know a lot about industrial quality control and W. Edwards Deming and the theories of quality control, and one of his great insights is when the workers are turning out defective products from a factory, it's not the fault of the workers. It's the fault of the system that they're given to work in. It's the system, and if you want to fix the products, you got to fix the system and not beat on the employees. Because if they're given a good system, they'll do it right. And same thing here, and we just had a blind spot. I'm the first, and I was head of the CDC's hospital infection program when we started those guidelines, and so I bear some responsibility, even though 30 years ago, but I still bear some responsibility, but we all do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haley. Okay, that's what I have for the written questions. Audience members, anybody else, please feel free to answer or ask your questions. They're all important, and we want to hear them all. Yes, ma'am. What's your name?
Tammy Bastian, and I have 2 questions. The first one being, you said that there can't be transmission by pets, but then you gave the bad example of transmission to West Africa. Can you reconcile those 2?
Oh, you mean bats? Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. Pets can't transmit it, dogs particularly. Now, dogs can become infected with Ebola, but they don't get sick. And remember, in order to transmit it, you got to be having bodily fluids spilled out, so you got to get sick. So dogs have never been implicated in a transmission to a person, but we do know they can have virus in their blood. Okay, so that's the story about dogs. Bats is a very interesting subject. For the longest time, nobody could figure out where Ebola is hiding in Africa, because the story was you would get some little village would suddenly, a doctor or a nurse would die. Somebody would go in and look, and sure enough, there were a bunch of other people dying, and so that's how they figured out it was an Ebola outbreak. So they would trace it back and see who was the first person that got it, and they would try to figure out where they got it from, and for 15 or 20 years, they couldn't figure out where it came from. And then some people made some great observations and noticed that some of these people were harvesting, I mentioned earlier, were harvesting fruit bats. And fruit bats, that animal is a delicacy in West Africa. In fact, I think East Africa too. It's very tasty meat. And so they noticed a predominance of bats or killing a primate, a gorilla or a chimpanzee. And so they pieced together, and now they believe from various studies that fruit bats somehow harbor it, the virus, and maybe aren't sick. And somehow they harbor the virus in their colonies. And then when a person comes in contact with a fruit bat, harvesting it for food, usually during the slaughtering process, they get exposed to the blood, and then they get sick, and then they, due to the cultural practices, it spreads in their community. Now, how did it get to West Africa? Because East Africa is way over here, and West Africa is way up here. I just read a new article just the other day that, you know, there's the new techniques of genetics where they can look at how fast these viruses are mutating, because the Ebola virus kind of has little changes, kind of like flu, makes little changes all at a kind of a constant rate, and so you can trace back based on how much, what's the genetic makeup of these viruses, and you can estimate when it came to West Africa, and they think it's the same strain as East Africa, but due to its genetic makeup, they estimate that it actually somehow got to West Africa in 2004. They're actually pinning it down to a year. They think somehow a fruit bat colony in West Africa got infected in 2004, and then it's been evolving separately, you know, in West Africa. So that's how they can tell the difference. And so when they know who the first case was in West Africa. It was a woman, a fairly prominent woman in the community who sold bushmeat, and she slaughtered a bat and was selling it, and then she got infected, and it went from there. Does that answer your question? It's very different from a dog.
I just wanted to reconcile that between the pets and the bat. Yeah. My other question, you gave us really good information on when it's most infectious. The 21 days, can you give us some of the information on the research that's been done that makes everyone comfortable that 21 days is enough time?
Yes. One of the fundamental measurements in epidemiology, study of epidemics, is what's called the epidemic curve. Some of you may have seen an epidemic curve. What you do is you graph the number of patients by day that their illness began, from the time they were exposed to when their illness began. So there will be a few that might get infected within 2 or 3 days, the first 2 or 3 days, and then more in 4 or 5 days, and more at 7 or 8 days, and then finally, at some point, you don't get any more showing up. And they found that for Ebola, regularly in all these epidemics, that curve peters out at 21 days. That's when it crosses the 0 point, and no more cases. Now, there's been some news just the last couple of days. In fact, late last week, the New England Journal of Medicine, one of our top journals, published an article from the WHO, World Health Organization, the compilation of information about the first 4,507 cases of Ebola in West Africa. And they showed epidemic curves from each of the 3 countries, and then a combined epidemic curve. And every one of them, right at 21 days, it went to 0. Now, there were also a few more little cases that petered out at the end. And those have been a source of a lot of discussion. Is it 21, or can a few be after that? The best explanation is that, and you didn't see that in the smaller epidemics. That's only in the really large epidemics that you see that little tail past 21 days. The explanation, I believe the explanation, is that in a small epidemic, you know when everyone was exposed because they're a small number, you can follow them all, you can work them all up. In a huge epidemic, it's chaos, and you don't really have very good information. And so there's a thing called double exposure. You would ask somebody, they would remember an exposure back, 30 days ago, but it turns out that really wasn't what infected them. It was another exposure 10 days ago, but they forgot about that one. Or maybe the people who were collecting the data just recorded the first one. And so it's such a small number of cases that looks like just the error in the data, in the date of the last exposure, the most important exposure is what we think. And in that article, that was acknowledged and discussed, and the WHO said, from these data, we still conclude that 21 days is the tried and true thing that we've used forever, and it's still valid and a good way to do it. And so wherever they've used it, it has not failed yet. So that's what we're doing in Dallas.
Dr. Haley, Dr. Siegel, thank you very much. We appreciate your time and willingness to come talk to us tonight. I also want to give thanks to a couple of folks that are key to us being able to put this together. First of all, Maggie Willis, who is the director of our nurses at the Garland Independent School District. I know she has been instrumental in terms of helping me and others get this together, and as well as being key to our response in our schools and on our campuses. And I know that has been obviously in this time of concern and worry about our kids. I know it's been a strain on you, and we appreciate you very much. In addition to that, I want to say thanks to our communications department. As always, great job in terms of communicating information, both on our campuses to our kids, to our communities. Chris Moore and your department, thank you very much. We appreciate you very much. With that, that's the end of our action items for this board meeting, and I want to ask our trustees, is there a motion to adjourn? So moved. Do we have a second? Second? All right. It's been moved and seconded. We'll adjourn this meeting of the Garland Independent School District Board of Trustees. Thank you.